In a quiet dojo filled with the soft sound of shuffling feet, a single moment shattered the peace. A white martial arts instructor, proud of his black belt and authority, turned his gaze toward the janitor, a hard-working black man who had spent years cleaning those very floors. What seemed like a casual request to join in for fun carried a weight far heavier than anyone in the room could imagine. The students watched, curious smiles spreading across their faces, unaware of the storm about to unfold. What happened inside that dojo would not just test strength, but expose something far deeper, something that left everyone who witnessed it questioning what true respect really means.
Before that unforgettable day in the dojo, the janitor was simply known as James. To most, he was the man who kept the floors spotless, the equipment in order, and the lights shining bright. Few ever paused to consider the life behind the mop bucket or the silent dedication behind his late nights. James wasn't just a cleaner. He was a father, a provider, and once a passionate martial arts student himself. But dreams had been put aside when reality demanded he work to support his family. The dojo was more than just his workplace. It was a place of quiet pride. He took comfort in seeing young students practice discipline, respect, and perseverance, values he deeply believed in. Though he never wore a gi anymore, his heart still carried the teachings he once studied in his youth. Yet, beneath the surface, there lingered an unspoken tension. James was respected by few, ignored by many, and occasionally mocked in ways that others brushed off as harmless jokes. To him, the dojo symbolized everything he loved about martial arts, but also everything he had been denied. On that particular day, as James polished the wooden floor with steady hands, he could feel the stares. The instructor's gaze lingered on him longer than usual, carrying a sharp edge that made his chest tighten. James had no idea that in just moments, a casual request would force him into the spotlight, not as a janitor, but as something far greater, or something far smaller.
The challenge began as a whisper in the dojo, carried by the amused glances of the students who didn't quite understand what was about to unfold. The instructor, confident and towering in his crisp white gi, clapped his hands sharply, calling for attention. With a smirk, he motioned toward James, who was still bent over his mop. "Why don't you show us what you've got?" The words were wrapped in mockery, delivered as though James were little more than an entertainer in his own workplace. The room erupted in laughter. Some students giggled nervously, unsure if this was a joke. Others grinned eagerly, expecting nothing more than a quick spectacle. A janitor fumbling in the ring, humiliated for their amusement. James froze, the mop heavy in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear of the fight itself, but from the eyes now fixed on him. He had spent years ignored in this room, invisible in the background. Now, suddenly, he was center stage. He tried to brush it off, shaking his head, muttering that he wasn't dressed, that he wasn't here to spar, but the instructor's smile widened, his voice dripping with superiority. "Come on, just for fun. Or are you afraid?" That word, afraid, stung. It wasn't just a question, it was a dismissal of James's strength, his dignity, and his years of sacrifice. The students shifted, whispering. The room's energy shifted from curiosity to expectation. Could he refuse without looking weak? Could he accept without playing into their game? James straightened slowly, his mind torn. Memories flooded back, his youth in martial arts, the discipline, the philosophy of respect that had once defined his training. And then the years of scrubbing floors, of being underestimated, overlooked, devalued. He looked at the instructor and realized this wasn't about sparring. This was about proving his worth in a space where no one had ever really seen him. With a deep breath, he stepped forward. The room grew silent. The students formed a circle, excitement buzzing in their eyes. Some pulled out their phones, already recording. James felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He stood barefoot on the polished floor, stripped of any uniform, any recognition, facing an opponent who wore both authority and privilege like armor. The instructor bowed with a mocking flourish. James returned the bow, though his was sincere, rooted in the teachings he still honored. They squared off. The air in the dojo was thick, every breath sharp. The first move came quick. The instructor lunged with a confident strike, expecting James to stumble, to fail instantly. But James's body remembered. His reflexes, though long dormant, sparked alive. He sidestepped, deflecting the attack with quiet precision. Gasps filled the room. The instructor's smile faltered. Another strike, this time harder, faster. James blocked again, his movements controlled, calm, carrying the grace of someone who had once lived this discipline. Each deflection fueled the whispers of the students. This wasn't going as they expected. Sweat dripped from James's brow, his muscles straining, but his focus never wavered. The instructor's attacks grew more aggressive, his frustration visible. He wasn't sparring anymore. He was trying to prove dominance, to crush James publicly. But James refused to break. With every block, every counter, he revealed a truth the room had never seen. Strength doesn't always wear a uniform, and respect cannot be demanded through mockery. And then it happened. A sudden clash, a moment where the instructor overextended and James's training instinct kicked in. His counter was swift, clean, undeniable. The instructor staggered, his balance lost, his authority slipping as the students gasped louder than ever before. For the first time, James stood not as a janitor in their eyes, but something far greater.
The dojo pulsed with silence, heavy and expectant. The instructor stumbled back, disbelief painted across his face as the janitor he had mocked moments earlier stood firmly, breathing evenly, eyes unwavering. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. But instead of laughter, instead of applause, the air grew colder. The instructor's pride had been wounded in front of his students. His authority, his status, his control, all threatened by the very man he sought to humiliate. His jaw tightened. His next attack was not for demonstration, not for practice, but for punishment. He came at James with raw aggression, fists flying harder, kicks sharper, each strike designed to put the janitor back in his place. James blocked, dodged, countered, but with every movement he felt the weight of injustice pressing heavier on his shoulders. This wasn't just sparring anymore. It was a battle fueled by arrogance and prejudice. The instructor wasn't trying to teach a lesson. He was trying to erase James's dignity. The students shifted nervously, whispers rising. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the imbalance they were witnessing. Others kept their phones up, recording every second, sensing history in the making. Then it happened. A blow landed, hard. The instructor's fist connected with James's ribs, sending a sharp pain shooting through his side. He staggered, clutching his chest, struggling to stay upright. The crowd gasped, but no one moved to intervene. The unwritten rules of the dojo demanded respect for the instructor, even when respect had long been abandoned. James's breath came heavy, his body screamed to stop, but his spirit refused to bend. He thought of the years he had endured, the jobs that had stripped him of recognition, the countless times he had been overlooked simply because of who he was. He thought of his family depending on him, his children who looked up to him, and the lessons he once believed martial arts represented. Honor, discipline, respect. Was he to let all of that be erased here, in this moment, under the glare of mocking eyes? The instructor smirked, circling like a predator sensing weakness. He lunged forward again, but James's eyes sharpened. Pain gave way to clarity. He wasn't just fighting for himself now. He was fighting for every silent indignity he had endured. The next exchange was brutal. Strike after strike, the instructor pressed harder, but James found a rhythm, his old training awakening fully. He deflected blows, pivoted, redirected force, every movement fueled by something deeper than technique. And then, one decisive moment. The instructor lunged recklessly, his arrogance blinding him. James spun, delivering a precise counter, the kind that only years of training could produce. The impact was undeniable. The instructor staggered, his balance broken, his body crashing against the mat with a resounding thud. The dojo froze. Every eye widened, every breath held. The untouchable instructor, the white belt of authority, the symbol of dominance, lay on the ground defeated by the man he sought to humiliate. For a heartbeat, James stood motionless, chest heaving, his gaze steady. He had not shouted, he had not gloated. He simply stood, silent but unshaken, the truth etched into his posture. But the silence broke not with applause, not with respect, but with something colder. A few students lowered their phones, their faces conflicted. Others exchanged glances, uncertain whether they had just witnessed courage or a violation of unspoken hierarchy. And the instructor, his pride could not accept it. Rising slowly, eyes blazing, he pointed at James, his voice trembling with rage. "Get out! You don't belong here." The words cut deeper than any strike, not because they were new, but because they echoed the same dismissal James had faced his whole life. The janitor had proven himself, not just as a fighter, but as a man of discipline and resilience. Yet in that instant, he was reminded that in some eyes, no victory, no strength, no dignity could erase the barriers built by prejudice.
The dojo stood frozen in the aftermath of the clash. The instructor, red-faced and seething, pointed at James with a trembling hand, ordering him to leave. His voice carried authority, but beneath it lingered the sting of humiliation. James, however, didn't flinch. For the first time in years, he wasn't bowing his head or shrinking into the background. He stood upright, chest rising with steady breaths, embodying a quiet dignity that no command could erase. He looked around the room. The faces of the students told a story of their own. Some still shocked, others conflicted, a few brimming with newfound respect. Phones had captured every second, and James knew this moment wouldn't remain contained within these four walls. The truth, once invisible, was now undeniable. But instead of celebrating, James simply lowered his gaze, not out of shame, but humility. He hadn't stepped into that circle to win glory or recognition. He had defended himself, his dignity, and perhaps unknowingly, the countless voices who had endured humiliation in silence. He walked out of the dojo quietly, each step echoing louder than the instructor's earlier command. Outside, the evening air felt cooler, lighter. For James, the fight had been more than physical. It had been spiritual. The janitor, who had been overlooked for years, had stood against not just a man, but a system of assumptions, stereotypes, and prejudice. And in that stand, he had reclaimed a piece of himself long buried under the weight of invisibility. The following days were telling. The video spread quickly online. What some had hoped to be a moment of entertainment became something far greater, a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths. Viewers around the world saw not just a sparring match, but a confrontation between power and humility, arrogance and quiet strength, prejudice and perseverance. The reactions varied. Some condemned the instructor, pointing out the clear misuse of authority and the cruelty of mocking a man who had done nothing but serve with dedication. Others, however, twisted the narrative, arguing that James had disrespected tradition, daring to outshine a teacher in his own domain. And yet, beneath the noise of arguments, one truth stood firm, that James's dignity had been witnessed. No longer invisible, no longer dismissed, he had reminded the world of something profound. That worth is not defined by a belt or uniform, but the strength of one's character. For James himself, the impact ran deeper than any viral moment. He returned to work the next week, mop in hand, just as before, but he wasn't the same man. Students glanced at him differently now. Some nodded respectfully, some whispered apologies in their eyes, and a few, braver than the rest, asked him questions, not about cleaning, but about martial arts. Slowly, the perception shifted. The janitor became more than the man who swept floors. He became a living example of resilience, discipline, and silent strength. Yet James knew the fight was far from over. The instructor never apologized. Prejudice didn't vanish overnight. Society still carried the weight of countless injustices that no single moment could erase. But this incident was a spark, a reminder that silence and invisibility only persist until someone dares to stand, even when standing comes at a cost. The bigger meaning extended far beyond the dojo. James's story was a reflection of countless others, workers overlooked, voices dismissed, individuals judged not by their abilities but by the color of their skin or the role they occupied. Racism doesn't always roar in obvious cruelty. Sometimes it whispers in mockery, hides behind authority, or disguises itself as tradition. But every act of quiet resistance, every refusal to bend, chips away at its hold. The lesson was not about fighting with fists, but about fighting with presence. James showed that dignity cannot be stripped away unless we surrender it. His courage invited others to reflect. How many times have we laughed at injustice, thinking it harmless? How often have we ignored the silent battles waged by those around us? And how long will we allow systems of prejudice to persist, unchallenged, in the spaces we call sacred? The dojo's floor may have been polished that day, but what truly shone was the truth, that respect is not granted by a belt or title, but earned by integrity. As James continued his quiet work, one thing became certain. The story was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever carried strength unseen. And so the question lingers. In a world still scarred by prejudice, will we stand silently in the background, or will we, like James, find the courage to step forward and claim our rightful place in the circle?